Were you aware of this?
No.
Or it was
No.
raised in the House of Commons today?
No, and I assume Mr. Morneau was aware of this sequence of timing because he's a very smart man. He's dealt with financial markets most of his adult life, and that the sequence of events would cause any right-thinking person to think that there would be, if not a real conflict of interest, then certainly the appearance of a conflict of interest to sell a large number of shares worth $10 million. A week later, introduce legislation that would negatively affect those shares.
That could be also insider trading.
Which is not for us to deal with.
Yeah, okay.
So as Parliament, we don't deal with insider trading. This has been an aspect of this story before. We have resisted those calls. That will be something for the regulators to look at. If somebody had privileged information, sold a large quantity of shares prior to that information becoming public, the information then becomes public. That is for those authorities and those regulators to decide upon. But that's incredibly serious. That is something, as you know, brings severe consequences, including jail time. So that's not for us to weigh in on.
After hearing what you heard today, what do you think? What would you like to hear next? What do you need to?
I want to know what Canadians have wanted to know from the start. What Mr. Morneau owns, how he owns it. Because as finance minister, he affects so much of what happens to the market, particularly to Morneau Chappelle and other things. It is lamentable that we've had to go through this drip of information that is only found out when the press dig, and that we have a Conflict of Interest Act for a reason. Did he inform the Ethics Commissioner prior to selling these shares? Did he inform her that he was about to introduce legislation that would greatly and negatively affect the value of those shares? This is just basic information. This is Ethics 101. I don't understand why this is so hard for Mr. Morneau, yet was given many, many opportunities today to clear the air over this, chose not to, and that's unfortunate.
How would you rate his performance today?
It was terrible. He looked evasive, and my Liberal colleagues looked incredibly concerned. I mean, they've talked to me about this. One minister last week told me, Mr. Morneau doesn't even realize he's in trouble.
Another Liberal minister told you that?
Yeah. He said, Bill doesn't realize he's in trouble yet. And neither does his staff, and he lamented the notion of a rookie minister being put such a high portfolio with a whole bunch of potentials for conflict of interest, which is true for Mr. Morneau. I just don't understand what seems obvious to everybody else involved with this story, that you can't benefit from decisions that you make once you're in public office, that the disclosure required in the private sector is greater than the disclosure that we require here in the public sector. So Mr. Morneau has been exposed to a much greater degree of transparency in his previous life. It's less so now, and he can't even meet the standard that we set here. I find it very confounding and really lamentable.
So do you think he still has shares in his number of companies that we don't know about?
Well, I would assume so, because he has told us that he has 5 other numbered companies. I assume that the valuation is not zero. That would be weird. But again, only one person can tell us that. The Ethics Commissioner can't, because she's bound by privileged and confidential information. It's Mr. Morneau who made the promise that he would tell us when he came into Cabinet what he owned and how he owned it. We're 2 years later and he still hasn't fulfilled that promise. All he indicated at the time was that he put his things in a blind trust. That wasn't true.